30,000 feet above the ground. A successful lawyer faces humiliation from a flight attendant who can't stand her presence in first class. But when the truth comes to light, this fight for justice reveals the airline's dark side, changing everything. Get ready for a story about racism, the power of the spirit, and an unexpected twist that will change the game. Jessica Morgan stepped onto the sleek Boeing 737 at Chicago O'Hare International Airport, her polished black heels clicking sharply against the jet bridge floor. At 32, she was a rising star in human rights law, her name already whispered in legal circles for her relentless pursuit of justice. Today's flight to Los Angeles was a rare moment of reprieve, a chance to recharge before diving into a high-profile case against a corporate giant accused of discriminatory hiring practices. She adjusted the strap of her leather briefcase, the faint scent of her jasmine perfume mingling with the sterile air of the cabin as she made her way to seat 2A in first class. First class wasn't new to her. Years of late nights, skipped meals, and courtroom battles had earned her this luxury. A plush leather seat by the window, a glass of sparkling water already waiting on the tray table. She settled in, smoothing her tailored navy blazer, and pulled out her phone to review her packed calendar. Her dark brown hair, pulled into a neat bun, framed a face that radiated quiet confidence. She exhaled, letting the hum of the engines wash over her, a brief escape from the chaos of her life. But that peace didn't last long. "Excuse me, ma'am?" The voice was crisp, edged with something that made Jessica's shoulders tense instinctively. She looked up to see a flight attendant standing over her, Carolyn Evans, according to the gleaming name tag pinned to her Navy uniform. Carolyn was in her early 50s, her blonde hair twisted into a flawless chignon. Her pale blue eyes narrowed slightly as they locked onto Jessica. Her smile was tight, the kind that didn't reach her eyes, and her posture screamed authority, or something more. "Yes," Jessica replied, keeping her tone even, though she already sensed this wasn't a routine check. "May I see your boarding pass, please?" Carolyn's words were polite, but the way she lingered, hovering over the seat, suggested this was no simple formality. Jessica reached in her blazer pocket, retrieved the pass, and handed it over without breaking eye contact. Carolyn's fingers brushed hers as she took it, her gaze flicking over the details with exaggerated scrutiny. She held it a beat too long, her lips pursing into a thin line. Carolyn murmured, almost to herself, before handing it back with a slight flick of her wrist. "Just making sure. Sometimes passengers get confused about their seating." Jessica raised an eyebrow, her voice steady as steel. "Not me. I know exactly where I'm supposed to be." Carolyn's smile twitched, a faint crack in her polished facade. "Of course," she said with a clipped laugh that sounded more like a scoff. She turned to move down the aisle, but not before muttering under her breath, low, but just loud enough for Jessica to catch. "First class sure isn't what it used to be." The words hit like a slap, sharp and deliberate. Jessica's jaw tightened, her fingers curling around the armrest. She knew that tone, that veiled disdain. She'd heard it too many times before in courtrooms, boardrooms, even coffee shops. It was the sound of someone who saw her skin, her presence, and decided she didn't belong. But she wasn't here to fight every petty battle. Not yet. She forced herself to focus, opening her email app as the cabin filled with the chatter of boarding passengers. She had bigger fish to fry, a case that could change lives. This flight was supposed to be her calm before the storm. Except the storm had already found her. Carolyn made her rounds, her heels clicking with purpose, but Jessica couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every few minutes, she caught the flight attendant's glance, subtle, fleeting, but loaded with something unspoken. Then came the first real jab. As Carolyn served the passenger across the aisle, a middle-aged white man in a crisp suit, she accidentally bumped Jessica's tray table. The glass of water teetered, splashing a cold streak across Jessica's lap. "Oh, my apologies," Carolyn said, her voice dripping with faux sweetness as she handed over a napkin. Her eyes gleamed with something that wasn't regret. Jessica dabbed at the stain, her calm exterior unshaken, but inside, Her instincts screamed, "This isn't an accident." "Careful next time," Jessica said coolly, meeting Carolyn's gaze. The flight attendant's smile faltered for a split second before she turned away, her muttering resuming. Too quiet to catch, but enough to set Jessica's nerves on edge. She wasn't imagining it now. This was deliberate. A power play at 30,000 feet. The plane taxied toward the runway, the captain's voice crackling over the intercom with the usual pre-flight spiel. Jessica leaned back, trying to reclaim her calm, but her eyes stayed sharp, tracking Carolyn as she moved through the cabin. The whispers started soon after takeoff, soft, conspiratorial exchanges between Carolyn and another attendant near the galley. Jessica caught fragments, double-check her seat, and can't be too careful these days. Her stomach tightened. This wasn't just prejudice, it was a setup. She glanced around the first-class cabin. Most passengers were engrossed in their tablets or sipping drinks, oblivious to the tension brewing in row 2. But one pair of eyes met hers, a young man in coach, barely visible through the gap in the curtain, adjusting what looked like a phone camera. He gave her a quick nod, almost imperceptible. Jessica didn't know him, but that nod felt like a lifeline. The fasten seatbelt sign dinged off, and Carolyn reappeared, her clipboard clutched like a weapon. "Ma'am," she said, her tone sharper now, "we need to talk about your seat." Jessica straightened, her voice cutting through the cabin's hum. "What about it?" Carolyn's smile was gone, replaced by a mask of forced professionalism and something darker. "There's been a mix-up with the booking. I'll need you to move to economy." The cabin went quiet, all eyes turning toward them. Jessica's pulse quickened, but her expression stayed ice-cold. This was no mix-up. This was war, and she wasn't about to back down. The cabin lights dimmed as the Boeing 737 leveled off at cruising altitude. The soft hum of the engines a deceptive lullaby against the storm brewing in first class. Jessica Morgan sat rigid in seat 2, her damp blazer a silent testament to Carolyn Evans' earlier jab. The flight attendant's request, no, demand, to move to economy still hung in the air, sharp and electric. Jessica's dark eyes locked onto Carolyn's pale blue ones, the clipboard in the older woman's hands trembling slightly despite her steely posture. "There's no mix-up," Jessica said, her voice low but firm, cutting through the murmurs of the first-class passengers. "I paid for this seat. Check your system again." Carolyn's lips twitched, a flicker of irritation cracking her professional mask. "Ma'am," she said, her tone sharpening like a blade, "I've already confirmed with the manifest. There's an error. You need to move, now, or we'll handle this when we land." "Handle it." Jessica leaned forward slightly, her calm demeanor a weapon of its own. "You mean call security on a paying customer for sitting in her assigned seat? Go ahead. I'd love to see how that plays out." A ripple of whispers spread through the cabin. The man across the aisle, a businessman in a pinstripe suit, lowered his tablet, his brow furrowing as he watched. A woman, too, rose back, shifted in her seat, her phone discreetly angled toward the confrontation. Jessica felt their eyes, their curiosity, but she didn't waver. She'd faced worse than this. Cross-examinations from hostile attorneys, threats from corporate cronies. Carolyn Evans was just another bully with a badge. The flight attendant's cheeks flushed a faint pink, her grip tightening on the clipboard. "I'm trying to resolve this quietly," she hissed, leaning in closer, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "Don't make a scene. People like you always do." Jessica's breath caught, the words slicing deeper than the spilled water. "People like you." She'd heard that phrase too many times, dressed up in polite smiles or spat outright, to mistake its meaning. Her pulse thudded in her ears, but she kept her face composed, a mask of steel. "And what exactly do you mean by that?" she asked, her tone icy enough to freeze the cabin air. Carolyn recoiled slightly, caught off guard but recovered fast. "I didn't say anything," she snapped, straightening up. "You're twisting my words." "No," Jessica countered, her voice rising just enough to carry. "You're showing your hand." The cabin grew quieter, the tension thickening like fog. The businessman coughed awkwardly, and the woman with the phone angled it higher, no longer hiding her recording. Carolyn glanced around, sensing the shift, and her confidence faltered for a split second. But she doubled down, her voice loud now, performative. "This isn't personal. It's protocol. If you won't cooperate, I'll get the captain." "Please do," Jessica said, folding her arms. "Let's see what he thinks of your protocol." Carolyn spun on her heel, her heels clicking furiously as she marched toward the cockpit. Jessica exhaled slowly, her mind racing. She knew this wasn't over. Carolyn wasn't the type to back down. But neither was she. She glanced toward the curtain, separating first class from economy, catching the eye of a young man she'd noticed earlier. He was still there, his phone barely visible, his expression unreadable. Who was he? A witness? A troublemaker? She couldn't tell, but his presence gnawed at her instincts. Minutes later, Carolyn returned, flanked by a younger flight attendant, a nervous-looking woman with wide eyes and a clipboard of her own. "Miss Morgan," Carolyn said, her tone saccharine now, "we've double-checked. The system shows your seat was reassigned due to an overbooking glitch. We need you to move." Jessica's eyes narrowed. "A glitch? Funny how it only affects me. Show me the manifest." Carolyn hesitated, her facade cracking again. "That's not necessary. Just show me," Jessica repeated, her voice a quiet command. The younger attendant fumbled with her clipboard, glancing at Carolyn as if begging for rescue. Carolyn snatched it from her, thrusting it toward Jessica with a glare. Jessica scanned the page. Her name, her seat, 2A, clear as day. No reassignment. No glitch. She handed it back, her lips curving into a tight smile. "Looks like your system disagrees with you." Carolyn's face reddened, her composure unraveling. "This is ridiculous," she muttered, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "You're being unreasonable." "No," Jessica said, her voice steady and piercing. "You're being discriminatory, and everyone here sees it." A soft gasp came from the woman 2 rows back. The businessman set his tablet down entirely, his gaze shifting from curiosity to unease. Carolyn froze, her eyes darting around the cabin, realizing she was losing control. Then, a new voice broke the silence, a deep, weary baritone over the intercom. "This is Captain Reynolds. We've reached cruising altitude. Please remain seated and enjoy the flight." Carolyn seized the moment, leaning in close, her whisper venomous. "You think you've won? When we land, you'll regret this." Jessica met her gaze, unflinching. "Try me," as Carolyn retreated to the galley, her heels echoing like gunfire. Jessica's heart pounded, but her resolve hardened. She wasn't just fighting for her seat anymore. She was fighting for her dignity. And unbeknownst to Carolyn, the young man in economy, Tyler Green, a freelance journalist with a knack for viral scoops, had captured every word on video. The real storm was just beginning, and it wouldn't stay contained at 30,000 feet. Below is part 3 of the rewritten story in English, titled "The Backlash Begins," with a length of approximately 3,200 characters, including spaces and punctuation, fitting within the requested range of 3,000 to 31,000 characters. This section intensifies the drama with a major plot twist, heightens the stakes, and shifts the battleground from the plane to the public sphere, all while adhering to YouTube's content policies, focusing on psychological tension and moral conflict rather than violence or hate speech. The narrative remains dynamic and gripping, tailored for an American audience, with added layers of suspense and empowerment. Part 3. The Backlash Begins. The Boeing 737 soared westward through the night sky, its cabin a pressure cooker of unspoken tension. Jessica Morgan sat in seat 2A, her posture rigid, her mind razor-sharp despite the fatigue creeping into her bones. The confrontation with Carolyn Evans had left a bitter taste, but the flight attendant's retreat to the galley offered a temporary reprieve. Jessica's eyes flicked to the manifest still clutched in her hand, proof that Carolyn's glitch was a fabrication. She tucked it into her briefcase, a quiet weapon for whatever came next. The cabin buzzed with low murmurs. The businessman across the aisle kept stealing glances, his expression a mix of discomfort and curiosity. The woman, too, rose back, middle-aged with sharp eyes and a sleek bob, had stopped pretending not to record, her phone now openly trained on the galley where Carolyn huddled with the younger attendant. Jessica felt the weight of their attention, but it was the young man in economy, Tyler Green, though she didn't know his name yet, who held her focus. His subtle nod earlier lingered in her mind, a spark of hope amid the hostility. Then Carolyn reappeared, her heels striking the floor like a war drum. She wasn't alone. Captain Reynolds, a grizzled man in his late 50s with a stern jaw and tired eyes, trailed behind her, his uniform crisp but his demeanor weary. The cabin fell silent, every passenger sensing the escalation. Carolyn's face was a mask of forced calm, but her eyes gleamed with triumph as she stopped at Jessica's row. "Miss Morgan," the captain began, his voice gravelly but measured, "I've been briefed on the situation. There's been a misunderstanding with your seat assignment. To keep things smooth for everyone, I'm asking you to move to economy." Jessica's stomach dropped, but her expression didn't falter. "A misunderstanding?" she repeated, her tone cutting through the stillness. "I showed your flight attendant the manifest. My seat is 2A. The only misunderstanding here is why I'm being singled out." Carolyn interjected, her voice syrupy with faux concern. "Captain, I explained there was an overbooking issue. She's refusing to cooperate, disrupting the flight." "Disrupting?" Jessica's gaze shifted to Reynolds, unflinching. "I've been harassed since I boarded, spilled water, veiled insults, now this. If anyone's disrupting this flight, it's her." She nodded toward Carolyn, whose cheeks flushed a furious red. The captain rubbed his temple, clearly wishing he were anywhere else. "Look, I don't have time for a debate. We're an hour into this flight, and I need calm. Move to economy, and we'll sort it out on the ground." Jessica's heart pounded, anger surging through her veins. "So, you're punishing me for her lies? Because I paid for this seat, full fare, first class, and I'm not moving unless you drag me out." A gasp rippled through the cabin. The woman with the phone leaned forward, her lens capturing every word. Carolyn's smugness faltered, but she leaned into the captain, whispering something Jessica couldn't hear. Reynolds sighed, his shoulders slumping. "Fine," he said, his voice tight. "If you won't move voluntarily, we'll have security meet you at LAX. Your call." The ultimatum hung heavy, a guillotine poised to drop. Jessica's mind raced, images of headlines flashing. Black attorney escorted off plane in first-class dispute. She knew how this could spin, how her dignity could be shredded in the court of public opinion. But she also knew capitulating now would let Carolyn win. She straightened, her voice steady despite the fury burning inside. "I'll move," she said, rising from her seat. "But not because you're right. Because this isn't over. You'll see." Carolyn's smirk returned, a fleeting victory, but Jessica's parting shot wiped it away. "Enjoy your moment," she murmured, low enough for only Carolyn to hear. "It's the last one you'll get." She grabbed her briefcase and walked toward economy, her head high, every step deliberate. The cabin watched in stunned silence, whispers trailing her like shadows. As she passed through the curtain, Tyler Green stood, his phone tucked discreetly in his hand. "That was wrong," he said, loud enough for others to hear. "I've got all on tape. This isn't staying quiet." Jessica met his gaze, a flicker of gratitude softening her resolve. "Good," she replied simply, settling into a cramped economy seat. The humiliation stung, but her focus shifted. She began typing furiously on her phone, documenting every detail while it was fresh. Carolyn might think she'd won, but Jessica was already plotting her counterstrike. Back in first class, Tyler uploaded the video to X, his fingers flying over the screen. The caption was short, brutal. "Flight attendant forces black woman out of paid first-class seat. Racism at 30,000 feet. Hashtag SkyWest exposed." Within minutes, the post exploded. Retweets, comments, outrage spreading like wildfire. Passengers around him whispered, some pulling out their own phones to check the growing storm online. Carolyn, oblivious in the galley, strutted back to first class, her confidence restored. But the woman with the bob stood, blocking her path. "You're a disgrace," she said, her voice trembling with anger. "I heard every word you said." "So did they." She gestured to the cabin, where unease was morphing into defiance. Carolyn's smile vanished, her eyes darting to the captain, who'd retreated to the cockpit. She didn't know it yet, but the tide had turned. On the ground, Jessica's phone buzzed with notifications. Tyler's video had gone viral, and her fight was no longer just hers. The real twist was coming, and it would hit harder than Carolyn could ever imagine. The Boeing 737 descended toward Los Angeles, the city's glittering sprawl emerging through the clouds as the cabin lights flickered back to full brightness. Jessica Morgan sat wedged in an economy seat, her knees pressed against the tray table, her phone buzzing relentlessly in her hand. Tyler Green's video had ignited a firestorm. Hashtag SkyWest Exposed was trending nationwide, with thousands of comments pouring in, from outrage to calls for boycotts. She skimmed the posts, her jaw tight, her resolve stealing with each word of support. This wasn't just her fight anymore, it was a movement. Back in first class, Carolyn Evans paced the aisle, her earlier smugness replaced by a jittery edge. Passengers whispered openly now, their phones lighting up with the viral clip. The woman with the bob, Ellen Carter, a retired teacher with a fire in her eyes, stood again, her voice cutting through the hum. "You can't hide this," she said, pointing at Carolyn. "The whole world's watching now." Carolyn's face paled, her heels faltering mid-step. "I don't know what you're talking about," she snapped, but her voice trembled. She glanced toward the galley, where the younger attendant, Lila, barely 25 and visibly shaken, avoided her gaze. The captain's intercom crackled, announcing the final approach, but it did little to quell the growing unrest. Tyler Green, still in economy, leaned forward, his phone capturing Carolyn's every move. He texted Jessica, "Keep pushing. This is bigger than her." The plane touched down at LAX with a jolt, taxiing to the gate as the seatbelt sign dinged off. Jessica rose, her briefcase in hand, her expression unreadable but fierce. As passengers filed out, she caught Lila's eye. The young attendant hesitated, then approached, her voice a whisper. "I'm sorry," she said, glancing nervously toward the jet bridge. "I should have said something. Carolyn's done this before, too many times." Jessica studied her, weighing the sincerity against the silence that had enabled Carolyn. "Then say it now," she replied coolly. "Silence doesn't fix this." Lila nodded, guilt etching her features, and slipped away as Jessica stepped onto the jet bridge. Outside, chaos awaited. Reporters swarmed the gate, cameras flashing as Tyler emerged, waving Jessica over. "Miss Morgan," he called, his voice rising above the din, "your story's everywhere. What's your next move?" The crowd pressed in, microphones thrust forward, but Jessica paused, her gaze steady. "This isn't about me," she said, her words clear and deliberate. "It's about accountability. SkyWest let this happen, not just today but for years. I'm not stopping until they answer for it." The statement hit like a thunderclap, amplified by the clicking shutters and Tyler's live feed. But the real blow came moments later. As Carolyn exited the jet bridge, her face a mask of forced calm, a woman in a gray blazer pushed through the crowd. Emily Reid, a former SkyWest flight attendant with a steely resolve. She held up her phone, a recorded statement already uploaded online. "I worked with Carolyn Evans for 5 years," she said, her voice ringing out. "She's targeted passengers, especially people of color, over and over. I reported her to management. They buried it every time." The terminal erupted, reporters pivoting to Emily as passengers from the flight nodded in grim recognition. Carolyn froze, her clipboard slipping from her hands, clattering to the floor. "That's a lie," she shouted, but her voice drowned in the uproar. Jessica met Emily's gaze, a silent alliance forming. This was the twist Carolyn never saw coming. A crack in SkyWest's armor, widening by the second. Jessica's phone rang. Her attorney, Marcus Tate, his voice urgent. I saw the video. Emily's statement changes everything. SkyWest calling, offering a settlement with an NDA. What's your play? No deal, Jessica said, her tone ironclad. They don't get to buy silence. We're going public, all the way. Marcus chuckled darkly. Thought you'd say that. Lawsuit's ready. This just got bigger. Across town, SkyWest corporate office was a war room. Rachel Kim, the airline's legal counsel, stood before a frantic board, her tablet glowing with Emily's video, already at 500,000 views. This isn't just Carolyn anymore, she said, her voice clipped. Reid's opened a floodgate. We've got ex-employees lining up to talk. If Morgan sues, it's a class action waiting to happen. The CEO, a silver-haired man with a clenched jaw, slammed his fist on the table. Fire Evans. Now, make it public. Then offer Morgan whatever it takes to shut this down. Rachel shook her head. She's not taking it. She wants blood. Yours, not just Carolyn's. The room fell silent, the weight of their negligence sinking in. They'd ignored complaints for years, banking on silence. Now, that gamble was collapsing. Back at the terminal, Jessica faced the cameras again, Emily by her side. SkyWest knew, she said, her voice steady but fierce. They let her harass people because it was easier than fixing the problem. That ends today. The crowd roared, Tyler's feed spiking to millions. Carolyn, cornered by reporters, stammered denials, but her career and SkyWest facade were crumbling. Jessica stepped into a waiting car, her phone buzzing with Marcus's update. Passengers from your flight are joining the suit. We got a case. She smiled grimly. The fight had just begun, and the truth was her weapon. Carolyn's reckoning was near, but SkyWest was next, and it would shake the industry to its core. The Los Angeles courtroom buzzed with anticipation, a packed gallery of reporters, activists, and former SkyWest employees spilling into the halls. Jessica Morgan sat at the plaintiff's table, her navy blazer crisp, her dark eyes steady as she faced the judge. Months had passed since the flight that changed everything, but the fire in her chest burned brighter than ever. Beside her, Marcus Tate, her attorney, flipped through a thick binder, testimonies, emails, and Emily Reid's explosive video, now viewed over 10 million times. This wasn't just a trial, it was a reckoning. Across the aisle, SkyWest's legal team, led by Rachel Kim, sat in a tense huddle, their polished suits a stark contrast to their grim expressions. Carolyn Evans was absent, fired publicly within days of the incident, her name now a byword for disgrace, but her shadow loomed large. The airline had tried everything, a $500,000 settlement offer, a hollow apology, even a smear campaign hinting at Jessica's combative nature. She'd rejected it all, her voice unwavering on every news channel. This isn't about money. It's about accountability. The trial had unfolded like a storm. Passengers from the flight testified. Ellen Carter's sharp recounting of Carolyn's slurs, the businessman's reluctant admission of the tension he'd witnessed. Emily Reid's words cut deepest, detailing a decade of ignored complaints about Carolyn, backed by leaked internal memos. They called it maintaining harmony, she'd said, her voice trembling with anger. It was cowardice. Now, as closing arguments loomed, Jessica took the stand one last time. The room hushed, her presence commanding. I didn't ask for this fight, she began, her tone calm but piercing. I boarded that plane expecting respect, not humiliation. SkyWest didn't just fail me. They failed everyone they let Carolyn target, everyone they silenced to protect their bottom line. This isn't one woman's story. It's a system that needs to change. Rachel Kim's cross-examination was ruthless, painting Jessica as opportunistic, but she faltered under Jessica's unflinching responses. You think I wanted this? Jessica shot back. I wanted a flight, not a lawsuit. You made this personal when you backed her prejudice. The jury deliberated for hours, the tension suffocating. When they returned, The foreman stood, his voice steady. In the matter of Morgan v. SkyWest Airlines, we find in favor of the plaintiff. A cheer erupted, quickly silenced by the gavel. The damages, $2 million for Jessica, plus a court mandate. SkyWest must overhaul its policies, implement mandatory anti-bias training, and establish an independent oversight board. Justice wasn't just served, it was carved into the airline's future. Outside, cameras swarmed as Jessica emerged, Marcus at her side. "This is a start," she told the press, her voice resolute. "But it's not the end. Every airline, every company, needs to know we're watching." Tyler Green, now a friend, recorded it all, his grin wide. The hashtag Justice for Jessica trended globally, joined by hashtag SkyWest Reform. Carolyn, meanwhile, sat alone in her dim apartment, the TV replaying her downfall. Jobless, shunned, she stared at Jessica's victory speech, her hands trembling. She'd underestimated her target and paid the price. Weeks later, Jessica boarded another flight, this time to D.C., invited to testify before Congress on airline discrimination laws. As she settled into first class, a new flight attendant approached, a young woman with a warm smile. "Miss Morgan," she said softly, "thank you. What you did, it's changing things." Jessica nodded, a rare softness in her eyes. "We're just getting started." The plane took off, soaring over a nation waking up to its flaws. Jessica gazed out the window, her mind racing with plans, speeches, coalitions, new cases. SkyWest was reforming grudgingly, under public pressure and legal scrutiny. Other airlines followed, wary of the precedent. Her phone buzzed with messages, support from strangers, stories of their own battles. She wasn't alone anymore. Back in Chicago, Marcus filed papers for a class action suit, fueled by dozens of ex-employees and passengers emboldened by Jessica's win. In D.C., lawmakers listened as she spoke, her voice echoing through the Capitol. Justice isn't a gift. It's a fight. And we're not done. As the flight leveled off, Jessica smiled faintly. The path ahead was long, but she'd lit the way. One seat, one stand had sparked a revolution, and she'd walk it to the end.